Okay, so yes, to start over. Welcome to this webinar on addressing residents' concerns about allowing accessory dwelling units and other types of housing in single-family residential areas. I'm Robert Liberty. I'm the director of the Urban Sustainability Accelerator at Portland State University. The Urban Sustainability Accelerator has been working on ways to promote accessory dwelling units, which we also know as granny flats or secondary suites, for about 3 years, working both in Portland and with teams in Seattle, Charlottesville, Virginia, and the District of Columbia, and with other teams working in other cities as well. We've been trying to promote them as a way of increasing the housing supply and accelerating a more compact form of growth that's more sustainable, but also looking into ways to influence their use and tendency, that is, to achieve equity and affordability goals. Equity goals are anti-displacement and wealth creation. This is the first of 3 webinars on accessory dwelling units. The second one, which will be held next Wednesday, October 2nd, is a progress report from 5 pilot projects looking on how to use ADUs to advance these equity and affordability goals. There'll be a third webinar later in October on the various educational programs for homeowners to assist in making a decision about whether to build an accessory dwelling unit. Our audience today, the people who have registered, stretch across the country from Virginia to California and Michigan to Texas. They will be able to chat with each other using the chat feature that's in the bottom of their screen. Questions and answers can be posed to individual panelists or to all the panelists using the question and answer function at the bottom of the screen. By the way, I will say to the panelists that whenever you make a sound, your image is featured. You might consider muting yourself when you're not presenting. So we'll have questions and answers at the end, and we'll do the best to address as many of them as we can. All right, with that, I'd like to begin. And our first presenter is Scott Wiener. He's a state senator who represents the city and county of San Francisco and northern suburbs in San Mateo County. Scott has previously served as a supervisor for San Francisco County, and he's been an advocate for legislation at the state level to allow much higher levels of development around transit centers. I should also note that in 2015, I think it was, California authorized accessory dwelling units statewide. Scott, would you like to offer your comments on how people responded to your legislation?
Sure. Well, thank you very much for having me and for doing this. This is a national issue in terms of a dramatic shortage of housing in many parts of the country, and it's great to have this communication and collaboration, because it's not just a 1-state or 2-state issue. So here in California, we're in an extreme situation. It's estimated that we have a housing shortage of 3.5 million homes, and that shortage is estimated to be equal to the combined housing shortage of the other 49 states. So it's estimated that California has approximately 1/2 of the national housing shortage. And the main critique I've heard of the 3.5 million home number is, no, it's not 3.5 million, it's really 2.5 million. So they sort of, that's their gotcha moment, that it's really 2.5 million. But either way, it is huge. It's multi-millions of homes. And we in the Bay Area, it's particularly bad in the last decade. For every home, for every, I think, 7 or 8 jobs that we've added 1 home. So we've really hit a tipping point after a long time, decades of anti-housing policies in California, where we've made it incredibly hard to impossible to build much housing at all. And it takes many, many years to approve even zoning compliant housing, and it's very, very expensive. And in terms of zoning in particular, and I should say overall, we're going through a painful process now in California of reevaluating the almost our extreme version of local control around housing. It's really extreme. Unlike public education or healthcare, we've essentially told cities you can do whatever you want on housing. We'll have some rules in place, but they'll be unenforceable and not mean very much. And if you don't want to build any housing, go for it. If you want to build only a little bit or don't want to have any low-income housing, go for it. And we've allowed that to happen. It's become a race to the bottom, and it's accumulated this massive deficit. So we're trying to rebalance to say we're not going to get rid of local control, but we're going to have a more balanced approach where the state sets standards and local control operates within those standards. And that's what this is played out in a few areas, but in zoning in particular. So California, up to 75% of the residentially zoned landmass of California is zoned for single family. And I think, I suspect that the viewers here know this, but most people, when they hear single family zoning, what they often don't realize, of course, is it's not just allowing single family homes, that it's banning every other form of housing, that even small apartment buildings or student housing or senior housing, anything that's not one unit per parcel is banned. And it's really important to make that clear in this discussion. And I think most people understand that that's bad. It creates a major math and geometry problem. If you have a multi-million home deficit and you say, well, we're only going to allow you to put one housing unit per parcel, you run into a math problem really, really quickly. And that's what's happened to us in California. And in particular, we have many areas of California, in the Bay Area, in Los Angeles, and other areas around major transit hubs, BART stations, Caltrain, LA Metro, it's Muni in San Francisco, major public transportation infrastructure that is zoned exclusively for single family homes surrounding it, which guarantees that not many people can actually walk to transit. We have major job centers zoned only for single family. Even in San Francisco, 70% of our land mass in small 7 miles by 7 miles San Francisco, major job center, major transit rich area, 70% of our land mass is zoned for only single family or 2 units at the most. And it's really not sustainable. So the state has been involved in local zoning issues actually since the early 1980s. It was in the early 80s that California passed a law mandating that cities allow ADUs, that allow people to put ADUs in their homes. For decades, that law was a dead letter. Cities generally just ignored it. There was no teeth in it. And it was in about 2015, as you mentioned, not that we first adopted the law, but we first started putting teeth in it. And it's been a cat and mouse game, unfortunately. And every year we pass several more ADU laws to put teeth into it and to make clear that when we say you have to allow ADUs, we really mean it. So for example, this year, there's a bill on the governor's desk to cap the impact fees that cities can charge on ADUs, because what we have seen is cities will say, okay, you can build an ADU, but we're going to charge you a $20,000 impact fee to do it, as if you were building a mansion. And so we're capping that. We are, excuse me, we've streamlined the approval process for ADUs. So cities cannot subject people to discretionary or conditional use or appeal after appeal. That it is a streamlined ministerial process to put an ADU in. So we have been methodically strengthening our ADU requirement, and we are seeing more and more cities around the state that are embracing ADUs. San Francisco used to be exceptionally hostile to ADUs. San Francisco has become very positive about it. Same with Los Angeles, and there are various cities around the state that have become much more open, but there are still many cities that try to make it incredibly hard to put an ADU in.
Scott,
yes.
Just I want to make sure in your time you talk a little bit about how you've addressed, the arguments that are being presented against allowing ADUs or changing residential zoning in California. I know it's been controversial. Can you tell us a little bit about what have been the most effective responses to these concerns?
Right. Yeah, and as we've also, I've been authoring a bill for 2 years now, going beyond ADUs to override local zoning to allow greater density near high quality public transportation and in job centers, so small to mid-sized apartment buildings in areas where they've been banned for a long time. because when you're closing a multi-million home deficit, you want to focus that housing near jobs, near transit. Otherwise, you're inducing sprawl and increasing carbon emissions. And the pushback that we get is it's really twofold. We have the arguments about the character of our neighborhood. Actually, I should say threefold. The character of our neighborhood. This is a single-family home neighborhood. I bought a single-family home to invest in a certain lifestyle, and you are completely ruining that lifestyle by allowing multi-unit buildings in my neighborhood, and it undermines the neighborhood character. And that argument, I think most people don't buy. We've seen from polling that a supermajority of Californians are fine with having apartment buildings in their neighborhood. And I think most people understand that the two can mix together. And so we've, I think, been somewhat successful in making that argument. We also get a pushback with ADUs and with full-on apartment buildings that you are creating all sorts of negative impacts in our community: parking, traffic, overcrowded classrooms, stress on public infrastructure and services. And that is in part because California, through Prop 13, which caps property taxes, makes residential development very unprofitable for cities. Commercial property is much more profitable. And so cities say, you're forcing us to accept more density, but we can't pay for it. And we are trying to do work to reform our tax system to make it easier for cities to raise this revenue. We also point out to people that even with our anti-housing policy of the last 50 years, our state has grown from 15 million to 40 million people. So people come here whether or not we build housing. They just pay a lot more for that housing, and people end up living in their cars and so forth. And then the third argument is from people who are concerned about gentrification and will this cause the cost of housing to go up and push people out. And what we try to make clear to people is that many of our cities have been gentrifying without any development happening. We had a big fight in the Mission neighborhood in San Francisco where there was a push to put a moratorium on new market rate housing as a way of reducing gentrification. And we pointed out that the Mission had seen almost no new residential development for many years and was experiencing huge gentrification. So what fuels gentrification is a lack of available housing, and that we can take pressure off by building more housing. Now, we want to make sure, and in the legislation I've done, we have strong anti-demolition and anti-displacement protections. We do not want these measures to become a license to tear down existing housing where people are living and replace it with more expensive housing. So we have to have those anti-displacement, anti-demolition controls in place. We also do have an affordability requirement in the law if a local community does not have its own affordability requirement. And so we've tried to work with progressives who have these concerns, and we've had a really collaborative relationship and have been able to come up with some good solutions. So that's where we are. I can't hear you. I think you're muted.
Thank you, Scott, very much. Next, we're going to hear from Lisa Bender, and I'm going to call up her PowerPoint. Oh, I have to become the host again. So let me do this. Actually, Scott, maybe you can see that you can make me host. Okay. There we go. All right, sorry about that. Let me introduce Lisa while I'm doing this. Lisa is the president of Minneapolis City Council. She's been an advocate over the last couple of years as part of the update of the comprehensive plan to change, to rethink at a basic level single-family zoning. And in fact, the City Council, I think, unanimously approved this change to open up single-family zones to duplexes and triplexes. And this issue is very present. It goes before the Met Council tomorrow. And then I believe your City Council will act on it later the next month, and it will go into effect in November. So Lisa, thank you for joining us, and thank you for your leadership on this issue.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. Is the volume working okay and everything?
For us, yes.
Right. So I will talk a bit about the last 6 years of housing policy in Minneapolis. I ran for office in 2013 against an incumbent who was generally less supportive of growth and the sort of change that our community is seeing, both in my ward, which is a relatively dense, walkable, transit-oriented place with 80% of the housing in my neighborhoods that I represent being rental housing, in a city that's 50%, 52% now rental. So I ran against an incumbent on a pretty clear platform of, the fact that our city is growing, it's changing, we need to embrace change and really work together to figure out how to make sure our city is inclusive and equitable and that we don't face the same future that we're seeing around the country. And I always say that we're so grateful to the expertise from other cities that we're learning about as we tackle with a little bit more time now. We still have affordable homes in our marketplace. We still have a chance to avoid the extreme crisis that we're seeing in other cities, but we need to act quickly with some urgency. So you can flip the slide. So Minneapolis is a place, I think like probably all of our cities, where people might say that they're a Minneapolis resident, but they really identify with their neighborhood and their community. And that is true, I think, across the city. We have really rich cultural communities in our city. We have great ethnic diversity, income diversity, and we have a really robust immigrant community with Hmong population that have been here for a long time, many decades now, the Somali population that has come in the last 20 years, and again is becoming very established, very, just a part of our community today. And so when people talk about their neighborhoods, they're very passionate in Minneapolis, probably the same as all of your cities as well. You can go to the next slide. Our city is growing. So I mentioned we're a 52% renter. Our population is growing. Like in San Francisco, I think some folks would rather we say like, we're done, we're good. But we're still not back up to our peak population from the 1950s. We're gaining on it. Our peak population was about 500,000 and we're at about 430,000 today. But we have a very low rental vacancy rate. So the folks listening here know that that means, simply put, it is hard to find housing because we do not have enough homes for the people who want to live here. And like in San Francisco, constraining growth only means that our constituents are seeing displacement. So in my ward, apartment buildings that were built at the turn of the last century or in the 1970s are being purchased by outside investors and flipped, or by local investors and flipped, where with very weak protections for renters at the state level and being preempted from a lot of meaningful protection for renters at the local level, we're seeing a lot of folks losing their homes, people who've lived in our community for a long time, families with kids in our schools, and this kind of displacement pressure is really stressing our community. The next slide talks about the issue of cost burden households. And I think it's important to acknowledge that when we are talking about housing in Minneapolis or any city in the country, that it is rooted in a history of racial exclusion in housing that was both intentional for over a century in federal policy, in local policies, as well, which continues to show up today. And I'll talk about that more in a minute as it relates to zoning, but as it relates to how we talk about renters and some of the concerns that Senator Wiener voiced earlier, I noticed that there's a lot of concerns that are voiced about renters that have a lot to do with who is a renter. And in Minneapolis, you're much more likely to be a renter if you are a Black household, a Native American household, a household of color, than if you are a white household. So I think we have to be clear and intentional when we are talking about housing to know that there's the history there and to kind of understand what our words really mean and what we're really trying to say when we talk about neighborhood character or when we say that renters are noisy or irresponsible. Those words and those things have a meaning sometimes, I think, beyond what the words actually say. And so the next slide goes back to last term, my first term on the city council. I was the zoning and planning chair, representing a ward that's 80% renter in a city that is facing one of the lowest rental vacancy rates in the country. And we knew we needed to create more opportunity for housing for people. We have been growing mostly along our transit lines with larger multifamily housing. We made 2 changes last term that made it easier to build smaller, more incremental density. And I don't use that word a lot, density. I use the words housing options or housing choices a lot more. But so we did 2 reforms. The first was legalizing accessory dwelling units. This was the first ordinance that I authored in 2014 as a new council member. And there was a lot of pushback from my colleagues. There was concern about all the things we've heard about: parking, traffic, people looking into our backyards, noise. We don't want renters in our community, even in neighborhoods with very high renter populations today. But we had 7 community meetings all around the city just to talk about accessory dwelling units. And we had a really great coalition of advocates and were able to pass that policy unanimously in 2014 after about 6 months of conversation. We did compromise on owner occupancy. So our ADU ordinance had an owner occupancy requirement so that only people who lived in their homes could add an accessory dwelling unit. It's a really big barrier that we were able to remove through the comprehensive plan update that we just adopted. We also reformed parking. I think it's worth mentioning that we completely eliminated parking requirements for 50 units and below, and that enabled us to see the smaller multifamily infill development that my constituents really say they want to see, but was precluded by parking requirements before. And I'll talk more about accessory dwelling units in the next slide. So we used a really graphic visual approach to talking about accessory dwelling units. What is one? Do we have them in our city? Yes, we do. We have lots of them in our city. We had an architect on staff who is in our planning department who was able to create these graphics that we used around the city. And we had some good allies in organizations like AARP, which talked about seniors needing housing options in our neighborhoods. We are about 60 to 70% zoned for single family before the changes happened, depending on if you use total land area or land area, developable land area. But most of our city is zoned for single family homes. And so we went out, we talked with people about the housing shortage. We talked about how adding more flexibility to people using their properties would allow lots of folks to benefit by creating another income stream, either for a young family or for a senior on fixed income, and just really talked about people's experiences living in our city. It is getting harder and harder to find housing, so we didn't have to do any convincing to really tell most people that we need more housing units today. So the policy did pass in the very end of 2014, summer of 2014, took effect in 15. We haven't seen a lot of them, partly because of our owner occupancy requirement, which again will be removed through the comprehensive plan, but also because detached accessory dwelling units are very expensive to build. We allowed external, internal, and ADUs in addition to your home. We saw a lot of conversions of illegal units to legal units. We regulate all rental housing in our city, so that was great because now we're able to license and regulate and inspect those units, which weren't before. A lot of those were in older homes, places that had been converted from larger Victorians into duplexes or triplexes. And again, that did eventually pass, I think either 12-1 or unanimously. I think we got the unanimous vote. The next slide talks more about Minneapolis 2040, which we just passed in December. So this was the comprehensive plan. We are required under state law to adopt a comprehensive plan. We have some affordable housing goals that we have to meet in that plan. But our Metropolitan Council, our regional agency, does not have a lot of authority or leverage over local land use decisions beyond that. So we did about a 2 to 3 year community engagement process. We talked about all kinds of things in our city, including, I think top of mind for so many people was housing affordability, stability, working on all of the displacement that we are seeing. And so part of this was to allow up to 3 units citywide. That did pass 12-1 in our 13-member city council. And I anticipate the changes that are coming now, the policy to legalize triplexes, to be non-controversial. We do have a lot more work to do on the bigger buildings. transit-oriented development. The state blocks us from doing a lot of things that could help us invest in community and leverage private development. Even our inclusionary zoning policy has been difficult to get through because of our state law context, but that is coming along with our comprehensive plan implementation soon. So I did want to highlight, as I mentioned earlier on the next slide, that we really did not shy away from talking about racial exclusion in housing in our comprehensive plan update. We didn't talk about it as much as we were just doing the ADU policy or these standalone zoning changes, but when we took this citywide view, we talked very clearly about how Minneapolis had some of the worst racial disparities in the country, and that was in part due to actions by our government in the past, and that if we want to do better and remain an inclusive and diverse city, we have to change how we're approaching land use, transportation, public investment, and public policy from all aspects of what we do. And so on the next slide, we showed maps that talked about how if you look back to the redlining maps that the federal government used to decide who could get a mortgage or not based on race, and we used information from a local college called Augsburg College that did a mapping prejudice project that looked to find racially restrictive covenants that said if you were Black or Asian or Jewish, you weren't able to purchase a home in that home, specific to the deed or a covenant on the deed. And so we mapped those things and we compared them to our zoning map, and our zoning map was identical. The neighborhoods that were redlined, where you could still buy a home, the places that had racially restrictive covenants are our single family neighborhoods today. And we didn't think that was okay as a city. We know that removing that zoning restriction is the very least tiniest first step toward building a more racially diverse and inclusive city. It will take a lot more, but we were able to talk with our community about that and not shy away from that history or what we need to do in the future. We did this on the next slide through very robust community engagement. And the city council approved this community engagement strategy. It said what we were going to do and what we weren't going to do and what we had staff do. And they really embraced. Our staff at our planning department did an incredible job of going out to community, going to street festivals or open streets or Ciclavia events. They had interactive engagement. They engaged specifically with cultural communities and with youth and talked in general terms, in accessible language about how people get around our city, what it's like to try to find a home, and really invite people to talk about their priorities for our future. On the next slide, you'll see, and you may have seen in the national press, it was not, an easy conversation. We had a lot of lawn sign wars and op-eds and editorials and really tense public meetings and a lot of pressure on elected officials. We also were doing this across an election cycle where every single policymaker in our city was up for re-election in 2017. But we were able to elect a council that is a coalition of folks who understand that we are growing and we need to add housing to our city, and that is very committed to equity and race equity in particular. Just a couple more slides here. I did want to highlight that
running a little bit late, Lisa. So.
Okay, I'll just say really quick. The last two things, we have a really incredible advocacy community here that was very aligned across topic areas, and we couldn't have done it without that alignment in an electoral and policy strategy. And then finally, we brought this plan through our council process very incrementally, starting with a big vision and goals, managing that across an election cycle, and then going into the details, but always holding on to that big vision and our shared values. That's all.
All right, well, thank you very much. We appreciate that. Sorry for hurrying you along.
Oh, no problem, sorry.
Our next presenter is Montgomery County Councilor Hans Riemer. Hans led the effort, and it was a long effort to authorize or liberalize provisions for accessory dwelling units in the county. And the county is 1.1 million people, encompasses a lot of the suburbs of Maryland, and he had a special challenge you may touch on is that the elected county executive was not supportive of this measure. So Hans, I'm going to make you unmute you and make you the host.
Great, I'm gonna hit share and let's see, this is supposed to
work now.
Here it comes. All right, does that work?
It is.
Terrific. Well, thank you so much for the invitation to be with you today. I really enjoyed the presentations that we just heard. I've heard so much about the initiatives in California and Minnesota, and really applaud the leadership from the elected officials. That presentation we just got from Minnesota was outstanding. And we heard a lot about that during our process. I'm just going to try to make this full screen here real quick. Montgomery County, Maryland is a largely suburban community. We also have a fair amount of our land set aside for farming, about 1 million plus people. And historically, we have had a lot of restrictions around accessory dwelling units. We had a comprehensive zoning code rewrite a number of years ago, and there was an attempt at that time to liberalize rules around accessory dwelling units, and a lot of compromises were loaded into that attempt that ultimately ended up resulting in a very, very meager production of accessory dwelling units. So I wanted to take another look at that and see if we could make an improvement, but I really wasn't quite sure where to start. And as I mentioned earlier, I read the book Backdoor Revolution by Cole Peterson about the Portland experience, and enabled me to really understand the issue in a very complex way, and was able to draft an ordinance that sought to really be a broad legalization of accessory dwelling units. I'll just say a few notes about this, because I found that there were a lot of issues that got confused in my conversation with people in the community. I would hear from a lot of people who didn't understand the difference between an accessory dwelling unit and just renting out rooms in a house. People tend to think of those as indistinguishable. And of course, there is quite an important distinction, but I found that in my conversations, I was starting just from the very basics of needing to explain to people what an accessory dwelling unit is, that it has a separate entrance, it has private space, it has a full kitchen, or very close to a full kitchen, its own private bathroom, it has to have a license, and that those could be interior units, as we saw the visualization a moment ago, or they could be exterior units, backyard cottages, or garage conversions. I had to keep repeating this all the way through, because I would hear from, especially the folks who were critical about crowding of single unit housing generally, and an assertion that that represented accessory dwelling unit policy, in a negative way. And most of the time you would find that there was no accessory dwelling unit. It was just, many people living in a house, maybe not even more than the code would necessarily allow, but people had a perception of it. So that was sort of a headwind we had to constantly try to work through. I found that really focusing on the benefits of accessory dwelling units was what made the difference. I think our community went through a process of consideration and hearing about the potential positive reasons that as a homeowner, you might want to have this flexible choice. You might want to have the flexibility to make this choice. And I think a lot of people were unsure about it when the conversation began. As things progressed, they heard enough to say, that might be something I'd like to be able to do one day. Particularly compelling points were the ability of a family to have multi-generational living. Adult children, as we all know, are incredibly, they're facing an incredibly difficult housing market. And it's very common now for adult children to live with their parents, or seniors, grandparents who want to move to be closer to their grandchildren. It's a housing option that I think more and more people would like to be able to have the option to exercise, and didn't realize that it might not be legal. So stressing that, also families with adult children with disabilities, having that proximity, having separate dwelling units, independence, but proximity was very compelling to people. A little less emphasis broadly on issues of affordability, or the ability of people to take in a renter, to subsidize, to make their own life more affordable. Although that was a compelling point, we were really trying to focus the message a bit more around an option that most people might very well like to have for their own purposes. And then for different people, that would be, that what choice they might exercise would be different. What we did, I'll brush through this, but basically backyard cottages were not allowed at all, really, unless you had an acre. And of course, anybody who has an acre probably doesn't really need to build a backyard cottage. We had a lot of restrictions on, you couldn't have one if there was another one closer than 300 feet to your house, so on and so forth. So the changes that we made, we're just, backyard cottages are allowed regardless of lot size or zone. There is a size limit on them, which generally will keep backyard cottages in the 600 to 900 square foot range, unless that's a larger lot. Basement units can be as large as the footprint of the house. That was important. A lot of people have a larger footprint basement. We did also allow lower ceilings in existing houses. We have older housing that was built to a different standard, and requiring people to dig out their basement would really be untenable. We removed the main parking requirement, which could have resulted sometimes in multiple spaces being required, and said you either have to build an additional space on your property, or if you have adequate street parking, you can get a waiver. But if you are within a mile of a rail transit station, you don't have any additional parking requirement. We did retain owner occupancy. We felt like that was something that spoke to people, and the experience of communities where we have accessory dwelling units now, it has been a real quality control. We didn't hear as much concern about that reducing the supply, but felt like saying, it was true to our primary rationale for why people would want one in the first place. And it made sense, and I think it helped convey to people that there were protections that would be in place, certainly licensing and inspection. We did make some changes that might, in a perfect world, you're not allowed to have another rental if you have a accessory dwelling unit, so you can't rent out multiple rooms in the house and have an accessory dwelling unit. Again, trying to tailor it a bit to our intended audience. And we did not allow a license for a short-term rental on that property. And we added funding in our budget for additional code enforcement, so that we could be more responsive to complaints we heard about the crowding of housing. One of the most effective things that we did was we researched the enrollment of students in our school system from our housing supply, and found that properties that have a single family house, and we compared the number of students coming out of those properties to properties that have a single family house and an ADU. And we found that there was essentially no difference. And we heard a lot of pushback about this is going to result in crowding of the school system. It's probably one of the biggest, arguments against it. And we felt that the evidence showed conclusively that there really was no different impact on schools than what was already generated by housing. Same token, we looked at cars, we looked at vehicle registrations. We found a very slight difference in the number of vehicles at a property that has an ADU and a primary house together versus just a house. On average, about every 3 accessory dwelling units will bring an additional vehicle. So again, when you looked at the numbers, it showed that the impacts were pretty modest or really negligible. There was quite a ruckus about it, and in the final stage of the debate, there were some very negative and quite racist comments made in the press. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see my picture next to a headline that says, "Don't turn Montgomery County into a slum." That was not unfortunately, my picture went next to that headline, but that was a letter to the editor that, created quite a firestorm. But in some respects, that firestorm strengthened the resolve of the council to proceed with the initiative, because there was an ugly side to the opposition that showed itself. So that's what I wanted to say, and I look forward to engaging in dialogue as we go. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Right. Our next presenter is Rick Moeller, who is a member of the Seattle Planning Commission and also professor of architecture at the University of Washington. And he has been engaged in this both in his civic capacity and his professional capacity for several years. He's going to tell you about the struggles there. I'm going to make you the host now, Rick.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry, I disappeared there. Everything just shut down for some reason.
We can hear you, so you can still keep going.
I'm
Okay.
going to, first actually I have to unshare this from Hans. All right. Okay. Now, Rick, you should be able to show your presentation.
Okay. Okay, I am going to talk about 5 years of process in 9 minutes. And I'm going to start with something that's very important to understand, which is Seattle's urban village growth strategy. It was put in place in 1994 in response to the State Growth Management Act. The urban villages come in 3 types: the urban centers, which you see in red, high density areas, hub urban villages in orange, and most relevant to this discussion are the residential urban villages shown in blue, which are either within or adjacent to single-family neighborhoods. The urban village strategy has been successful in increasing transit ridership, but there's a flip side to it, which is that it was used as a negotiating tool with single-family homeowners in the mid-90s under the guise of neighborhood planning to ensure that they would not be impacted by future growth. So there are 3 major components of what's happened in the last 5 years. One is the Housing Affordability and Livability Agenda, which was released in 2015. And then the other 2, one being mandatory housing affordability, which was enacted in April of this year, and the DADU ordinance, which was enacted in July of this year, both fall under the umbrella of HALA. So in 2014, the then mayor put together a task force of stakeholders, 28 stakeholders, and charged them with coming up with recommendations to address our housing affordability crisis. And what they came up with was the Housing Affordability and Livability Agenda, or HALA, a suite of 65 recommendations focused on our housing affordability crisis. And one of those recommendations was the elimination of single-family zoning. That recommendation was leaked to a Seattle Times columnist before the report was released, and he reacted to it very negatively for 2 reasons. One, he reacted against the recommendation itself, but he also reacted against the process because it was so different from the neighborhood planning process of the mid-1990s that single-family homeowners were used to and expecting. What did move forward was mandatory housing affordability, an inclusionary zoning strategy that provides developers with increased development capacity in exchange for affordable housing on all commercial and multifamily properties throughout the city. It passed relatively quickly in the urban center, or the urban centers, the urban villages that I mentioned, such as downtown and South Lake Union. But when it came to the residential urban villages in our single-family neighborhoods, the response was very different. I'm going to focus on one of those, the Wallingford residential urban village, where I live, circled here. And here you can see it in detail, and you see the black boundary of the residential urban village established in 1994, and you can see that captured within it in the cream color is single-family zoning. That zoning was upzoned to multifamily as a part of MHA, and this impacted 6% of all single-family parcels in the city. This led to tremendous controversy. These are my neighbors, the Wallingford Community Council staging a mock funeral, mourning the death of the neighborhood voice and democracy itself outside a city-sponsored MHA event. And here our city council member, Rob Johnson, is recast as the Grim Reaper stealing the soul of the neighborhood. Across the city, a group called SCALE, the Seattle Coalition for Affordability, Livability, and Equity, comprised almost exclusively of single-family homeowners, appealed MHA to the Growth Management Hearings Board. And you can see their concerns at the bottom: displacement, impact of height, bulk, and scale, loss of historic resources and tree canopy, and insufficient open and park space. But I want to highlight this one: the city ignoring the neighborhood plans that neighborhoods agreed to in the mid-1990s. In other words, we had a deal and the city broke it. Their appeal was unsuccessful and MHA moved forward. And at the same time, the city was looking at strategies to remove barriers to backyard cottages and accessory dwelling units because the production of ADUs had been paltry to that point. And so they were looking at minor changes to the size and height of ADUs, the reduction of off-street parking, the removal of the owner occupancy requirement, allowing 2 ADUs, either 2 ADUs within the principal dwelling or an ADU and a DADU. They put a cap on the size of new houses in single-family zones. And the city released a determination of non-significance under the State Environmental Policy Act, meaning that this would not have to go through an EIS process. That was appealed by an architect and former Seattle Planning Commissioner, Marty Kaplan. He had the support of his neighborhood community council. They hired a land use attorney and appealed the determination of non-significance to the hearing examiner. Tremendous support from the Seattle Times, which is very much opposed, or I should say, the Seattle Times editorial board, which is very much opposed to increasing density in single-family zones, giving Marty Kaplan a tremendous platform from which to work. And they were successful in their appeal, forcing the city to do an EIS. The city did the EIS, and to its credit, it went much further than it had to in this area. It really pushed beyond ADUs and for the first time used a racial justice and social equity argument and talked about the legacy of racial discrimination, especially in our single-family zones. This really galvanized support for ADUs, especially among those who were already supportive of them. But it didn't stop the Queen Anne Community Council and Marty Kaplan from appealing the EIS, but they were unsuccessful in doing so. And so in July of this year, the legislation was put in place by Mayor Durkin, who also released an executive order authoring the city to explore ADUs as an affordable housing strategy, to support low-income homeowners in building ADUs, and to create a suite of pre-approved detached accessory dwelling unit plans to make it easier, faster, and less expensive for homeowners to build them. At the same time, the state legislature was looking into reform of our State Environmental Policy Act, which has become extremely problematic, being used as a tool to thwart environmentally progressive policies. And so basically, what this would allow local jurisdictions to do is adopt these measures so that they could reduce the length of time of appeals should they occur, but also to give certain projects and certain land use legislation what's called safe harbor, protecting them from these appeals in the first place. Well, I should say it's extremely likely that the City Council will pass this before our upcoming elections in November. So in December of 2018, the Seattle Planning Commission released its report, Neighborhoods for All, and for the first time in 5 years, reopened the question of increasing density and flexibility in all of our single-family zones citywide. It was relatively well received by the press, and we are currently in the process of taking our talking points on the road, going neighborhood by neighborhood to explain what our role is within the city, to share research and strategies from our report, and to discuss with neighbors what are additional strategies that we can employ to improve livability. One thing that's important in this conversation, and we really hope that it will change the conversation from those that had come before, is that we are not elected officials and we are not paid city staff. We are simply volunteers, stewards of Seattle's comprehensive plan, and reviewing plan and policy efforts and advising the mayor's office and city council. One of the strategies that we are looking at is revisiting the original urban village growth strategy from the mid-1990s. We are encouraging city council to review the urban village growth strategy through a lens of racial justice and social equity, as the city is now required to do by law. And we're actually looking at the specific urban village boundaries and requesting that they reflect sound planning principles, such as a 15-minute walk shed to frequent transit, as opposed to the boundaries, to what the boundaries actually represent, is simply the political power of the adjacent single-family neighborhoods who were in place 25 years ago. So we'll continue these conversations throughout the city. The commission will collaborate with the University Department of Architecture in a studio that I will teach to develop visualizations and metrics so that we can share these with neighbors and with elected officials to remove some of the fear of the unknown. We're going to recommend updates to the city's comprehensive plan, which will start in 2020, and we'll identify additional strategies to target racial disparities. So to the concerns that we hear are the concerns that we're here, that elected officials and others are hearing throughout the country: parking and traffic congestion, tree canopy, speculative development, displacement. But some of the specific concerns we often hear in Seattle is this notion it's top-down, one-size-fits-all zoning. That was a very strong argument that was used against the ADU DADU ordinance, which is a very peculiar argument given the fact that single-family zoning itself is one of the best example of one-size-fits-all zoning that we have. And in addition, the process, an expectation that was created in the mid-1990s that single-family homeowners could dictate land use policy in their neighborhoods, and there is a tremendous anxiety about the loss of that control. We have the legacy of the 90s neighborhood planning that I mentioned. We also have other cultural aspects that we're dealing with, which are much more nuanced and hard to pin down, like the Seattle process, which you can look up on Wikipedia, where perfect is the enemy of the good. We have a very strong populist and anti-growth ethic, which was started by a group called Lesser Seattle in the 1950s, which continues as part of the city's urban mythology. We have a very strong populist anti-government baked into our state constitution as well. So consequences of this last 5-year process: we have our city council elections coming up in November, and we have lost 2 of our housing champions who will not run for re-election. Rob Johnson, who sponsored the MHA legislation, and Mike O'Brien, who sponsored the ADU-DADU legislation, will not run for office. And so the composition of the council is in question. Will they be replaced by housing advocates who are looking for progressive reform, or will they be replaced by council members who will instead address the concerns of the single-family neighbors in those neighborhoods? So that's all I got.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. I'm sorry, thank you, Rick. We're going to move on to Michael. Rick, could you push the button that ends the sharing? Thank you.
Okay.
So Michael Anderson is a senior researcher at the Sightline Institute, which is a think tank that does research and promotes public discussion around sustainability issues across the Pacific Northwest. He's going to describe the debate about Oregon Senate Bill 2001, which passed and was signed into law this summer, and the simultaneous, although I think a lot longer running, residential infill project in the city of Portland. So Michael, I'm going to make you host, and then please take it away.
Thanks a lot, Robert. And I'm attempting to share the screen here.
All right, first I have to do this. All right, you should be able to share the screen now.
There we go, cool. All right. Thanks a lot for the invitation to join. I'm honored to be in this crowd. As you've noticed, I'm the person here who is not an elected official. I am just a nerd, but I'm a nerd for ADUs. Among other things, I live in an ADU with my wife and son. And like Robert said, I'm going to be speaking more, though, about duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes. Those were legalized statewide by House Bill 2001, and the local implementation of that bill, the residential infill project in Portland, is going to legalize, I think, fourplexes on all lots with a bunch of other good add-ons to that. I'm going to elide the two a little bit in my discussion, so forgive me to that. I'm happy to go into more detail, but I'll be talking mostly about 2001 with some anecdotes from residential infill. In any case, I'll do a quick thing about Sightline. I am a writer there, as Robert said, and we are a regional sustainability think tank. We think cities are good. We focus on our region is the Pacific Northwest, or Cascadia, in trying to create the most welcoming identity for that region, the most economically prosperous and environmentally sustainable in the world by some measures. The work of zoning reform is, I like to think of it as relegalizing cities. That's a picture of Cincinnati. I grew up in Toledo. I think a lot about the context of that sort of background that I come from when I am thinking about what we need to do here in this job-rich part of Oregon. We have this new law, fourplex relegalization. I'm going to talk about how it happened. First, I'm going to talk about what it does. It allows, in fact, it requires cities to allow fourplexes in all neighborhoods for cities of 25,000 or more and throughout the Portland metro area. So that's 0.5 million people are affected in that context, and there are another 300,000 who are in cities between 10 and 25,000 who are also affected by a duplex legalization. So striking down local bans on these things, as Scott would put it, I think. This is nothing new, of course. We have these middle housing homes in all of our cities. It's about 10% in most smallish cities in Oregon, and it's about 10% in most smallish cities in most of the country. You can see 20% in Bozeman there is 2 to 4plexes. And that's not true in lots of suburbs because they were built after what bans on these homes became widespread, but in lots of older cores, they are allowed. They're just not in the places people necessarily want to be or where they are close to the jobs, and they're not dispersed into the neighborhoods with the most privileges. The Oregon law also struck down parking requirements and anti-rental discrimination for accessory dwellings. Some people call it owner occupancy requirements. I like to call it anti-rental discrimination. The Oregon law also voided future HOA covenants that are backdoor private bans on these things. We haven't yet taken a crack at past existing HOAs. That's legally tougher. I should acknowledge before I go further, I think the single most important part of this was we had a committed leader in House Speaker Tina Kotek, a former fourplex resident herself. She's a Democrat. She's now a homeowner in a gentrifying neighborhood in North Portland. And so she's seen this from multiple angles, and she was extremely committed to this, putting a lot of her weight behind it, talking for hours with wavering legislators, personally doing lots of media. She made this a big priority, and it worked. It worked in part because of a years-long process of coalition building and public outreach. I'll talk about that in a bit more detail soon. That's Vandana Shrestha of AARP, our local AARP chapter, our statewide AARP chapter, was completely essential in building public education and narrative around this, I would say. And Vandana got religion on this years ago after seeing a Dan Perolick talk in DC. This is a walk she was on, visiting historic missing middle homes in Portland and showing people how they work. The coalition building was led mostly by environmental groups, so that's the Thousand Friends of Oregon most prominently. Robert used to be the director and is sort of a long-time anti-sprawl group that has thankfully come down on the side of being pro-infill when you're talking about the urban context, because of course that's the way to make anti-sprawl policies socially just. It's been funded mostly by foundations interested in housing affordability and environmentalist individual donors. I'm also looping in Sightline's work on this to support efforts in Portland and now actually both of the people, me and my colleague Madeline, who were working at Portland for Everyone, have now moved to Sightline with a similar donor base, so that was not our problem, thankfully. Madeline's work involved 3,000 face-to-face interactions with Portlanders from 2016 to 19 over those 3 years between the first bill COTEC introduced in 2017 and the second in 2019. The first was a duplex legalization. It failed, though it became an ADU legalization. And then the more ambitious fourplex legalization plus awesome ADU reform came after that. So in the course of those events, we built an email list of 1,200 housing supporters, and we activated them when the time was needed. Leading the coalition, the single most important factor was bringing nonprofit housing developers to the table and putting them in front of the both the policy and the politics. So they're the ones who are working often in homes that we are trying to make possible. This is a habitat project, and the small attached homes are Habitat's bread and butter, the same for many CDCs around the state. So they had the incentive, they had the know-how, and they had the brand that moved the issue forward. We also had a wide variety of unexpected alliances. The more unexpected, the better. I'm not going to run through these individually, but I will say that this was, in many cases, the result of personal relationships built over those years of organizing and relationship building and strategic work, in particular by Madeline. Opal is in here in part because Madeline was on a bike racing team with their policy director. The Street Trust is on there because I think in part the executive director happened to see that a photo of a historic duplex that we used in one of my articles was her former home. Portland Public Schools was in there because the wife of one of the volunteers is their lobbyist, and at the last minute he was like, hey, should we get PPS to endorse? And yes we can. It turned out that one of the key swing senators was a former PPS employee. That helped too. In any case, you get the idea. Sunrise PDX resulted from a random Twitter conversation between a volunteer and a Sunrise organizer that magically resulted in people being persuaded on the internet. It was a ton of these individual conversations that manifested gradually into a coalition that we were able to tap and move forward. Of course, the opposition is familiar to all of us. The word she's saying here is huge. She's describing the giant home near her home that knocked down a tree. It's strange to me, at least, that she was raising this in the context of legalizing fourplexes when the giant home next to her house was already legal, of course. But that was the nature of the conversation, and I think, as some other people said, in some ways it is really good when you give this opposition a chance to voice its opinions, because it's not a very sympathetic one. I'm going to focus in the last few minutes on specific lessons from messaging. I'm a writer mostly, so this is my expertise. There are lots of other lessons to be shared on the politics and the policy of it, but I will focus on this. We tried to frame this specifically as re-legalizing middle housing. We didn't say ending single-family zoning. We especially did not actually try to say single-family zoning. We use single-detached zoning is the term that we've embraced here. And so we're talking about lifting bans. Occasionally, if we have to say what we're against, we say we're against single-detached zoning. And most importantly, I think we talk about re-legalization of past options. We make the past a big part of our story. Part of the technical characteristics of the residential infill project, that's the Portland level proposal, is to reduce the total allowed FAR on properties. And so though this rule reduces the productivity of the law by quite a bit and is maybe not good, the rhetorical advantages of being able to position yourself against McMansions are very powerful, and they will peel off the people who are sort of, I would call soft NIMBYs, people who are opposed to change, but not actually opposed to more housing. And if you can do that, then the only people who are left are the ones who are opposed to people, and that's not a very sympathetic constituency. That's simplifying, of course, but that's the gist of it. We also have tried to focus specifically on our community's history. So in Portland, 1924 was the year that Portland began banning middle housing. Using the specificity of that year, is persuasive. I think it also lets us talk about the political context of that vote. It was happening at a time when the Klan was literally in charge of Oregon politics. The Speaker of the House was allegedly in the Klan and passed a law that banned immigrants from owning property, among other things. So we also talk about 1959, the year Portland expanded that ban citywide. And I put this in actually mid-presentation because President Bender might enjoy it. We all did the same rule, the same exercise, looking for restrictive covenants and using the Hulk maps to connect to the history. Another big lesson for us, show, don't tell. Every single person, if you can, who is going to learn about an ADU legalization or duplex legalization proposal needs to see an image of what is being proposed before they get it in their brain, because otherwise they will definitely get a really, really scary image in their brain in a lot of cases. So to that end, Sightlines published this free to use photo library at Missing Middle Photos. You've got the line there, it's a Flickr library, and you can Google it too, but we've got lots of photos to hopefully help you and others and reporters illustrate these in their stories. Finally, I think there is usually a better messenger than you. Here I've got Steve Massanetti of Habitat again. He was sort of our go-to person when the media called to say they want to talk to somebody. We pushed them in his direction. There are others, of course, as well. Lisa Bates is a planning professor at Portland State University, was really valuable, and other folks who can talk to different angles on this stuff with greater moral authority than a sustainability institute, who everybody assumes incorrectly is funded by home builders, let alone home builders themselves. In any case, the final result of this was that we got broad bipartisan majorities of both houses to pass this. I did not expect this. The author of the bill did not expect this to be done without a bigger set of compromises, but it happened. And as you can tell, one catch, it could not have been done on party lines. Both parties required the other party to jump off the bridge with them, as it were. And they both landed in warm water, I think, because though this law has many, many ways it could be improved and will certainly not solve every problem, it's the first of its kind in the country. It makes me very optimistic for the future of state-level legislation as a sort of area where the political incentives are sufficiently aligned to change a lot of things for the better without the tragedy of the commons that you see, especially in the suburban context, I think.
Right.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. And can you end the sharing?
Oh, yeah. Maybe.
All right. Call on those who are attending, if they would like to submit questions, use the question and answer function that you'll see. Let's see if I can.
I need to do that. No, I don't. Sorry. Please reclaim it if you can.
All right.
There's a stop sharing button somewhere that you may need to hit.
Yeah, no doubt.
All right, we will, here we go. I think you're on your way.
I'm on my way, sure.
All right, so if there are questions, we can take them now. Do we have questions from our attendees? None yet. I have one for our panelists. One of the arguments I saw, thank you, Michael, one of the arguments I saw made, I think in a column in response to Scott Wiener's legislation was that, oh, you don't want to interfere with the free market. I found that a little baffling, but I wondered if the other panelists have heard that argument and what you found was the most effective response. Hans, you're chuckling, so maybe you would like to tackle that.
Well, it's amusing, of course, because this is the most restrictive use of property that you could possibly imagine. You could only build one type of dwelling unit, a single detached unit. So there's no free market there in terms of how you can use your land. You would think that there would be a group that would say, I would like to have more control over my property. But we found that urge was sort of, to the extent that might have been a helpful urge, it was subsumed by hostility to what that really might mean. And I think there's kind of a convergence of the type of person that might have both of those points of view. So, that wasn't a big factor for us. I think you do want to have a functional housing market that provides housing at different levels of income. And that's really that's the problem in so many communities, is the housing market itself has been just, crunched, restricted. And we're trying to open it up so that it can be more healthy and produce better outcomes for people.
I'll pose a question, and Senator Wiener's back. And Scott, if you want to unmute your microphone there.
Yes, apologies for that.
So I know that this has been true, I think every place this debate has come up, is that there were progressives who felt that this would simply accelerate gentrification. You mentioned the discussion about the mission, undergoing gentrification without any housing, but this comes up again and again, and it's perhaps you would like to comment a bit more, or invite Lisa or Michael, and if Rick can rejoin us to comment on that issue, because I know it also came up here in Portland. In fact, the Planning and Sustainability Commission had a divided vote after these years of effort, and a bare majority approved the residential infill project. And those who were opposed, it was entirely about concern about planning for being ready for displacement, as opposed to any concern about density. But Scott, you want to take a crack at that? And now I see
Sure.
some questions coming in.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important in any development plan to have anti-displacement protections, tenant protections, demolition protections, and there are ways of doing that. It's never perfect, but you can have strong protections in place. And I think it's important to distinguish here. So there are progressive housing advocates who have very, very authentic and real concerns about displacement, because they have seen how it can go wrong and the damage that it does to low-income residents who are kicked out. Their buildings are cleared out to make way for new development, and it can be done really badly. And these advocates, in my experience, they have concerns, but they also understand the need for more housing. And we've been able to work very effectively with them, both in Los Angeles and the Bay Area, to come up with good approaches. And so then you also have people who label themselves as progressives, but are actually not. And they latch on to the gentrification arguments. We've seen it with, wealthy white single-family homeowners who, in cities that have spent decades keeping affordable housing, low-income housing out of their communities, and they all of a sudden are just completely devoted, so they profess, to we should only build subsidized affordable housing. Yes. Oh, this is going to cause gentrification, and it's very it's crocodile tears. These people, it's not authentic, but they're latching on to progressive critiques, and they're not doing it because they want to work to try to reduce gentrification. They just want to oppose development. So we have to distinguish between the two. They're the fake progressives who are actually NIMBYs and just don't want more development. And then there are actual progressives who have real concerns to which I'm sympathetic, and we can work with them.
Okay, we have a question now from Dan Hardcastle, who's in AddUp in Washington, D.C. Here's this question. For those of you who have recently passed legislation, how will you define success in terms of ADU production? Who would like to tackle that?
I'll start. I was asked that a lot. I viewed Seattle as very successful, Portland as very successful, and they were in the range of 500 to 600 units a year, as I recall. They have housing markets that are much more strained than ours. So I never really knew. I don't know, but I would like to think 200. That would be quite a success, given our very meager annual production of new housing. we're less than 1,000 units of new housing a year in a community of 1 million people. A couple hundred would be a lot. So I think over time this will really add up, but that was my guess, a couple hundred.
Could I add to that, Robert?
Please, Rick.
Sorry, I disappeared again. I'm having some tough technical difficulties here. The Planning Commission in Seattle has been very supportive of the ADU-DADU legislation, and we continue to be including efforts to use accessory dwelling units as an affordable housing strategy, and the pre-approved plans that the city is proposing to put forward. How successful those plans will be is another question. But we do see ADUs as just one of many strategies that we have to employ in our single-family zones. Prior to the legislation that was passed, the EIS estimated that we'd have about 2,500 additional units, ADUs, over the next decade. With the new legislation in place, it's anticipated to bump that up to about 3,500 units over the next decade. The reality is we need about 35,000 units of housing over the next decade just to accommodate the growth in the city. That doesn't include the shortfall of housing that we already have today. So ADUs are clearly a piece of the puzzle, but we think we need to go much further than ADUs in our single family zones. The other thing that we're really interested in the commission, and this is where we believe we have a more compelling argument with single family homeowners, is that we need to expand opportunities for home ownership in our single family zones, not just rental opportunities. We need more people to have access to the wealth building potential that home ownership provides. And we are seeing some ADUs that are being turned into condos. The city's kind of just letting that happen. They're not taking a position on it. It's obviously very legally complicated. And we would much prefer to allow, for example, an aging homeowner who would like to stay in place, is house rich and cash poor, to sell off their backyard and have another household be able to build a separately owned unit in the back. So we see ADUs as a piece of the strategy, but we need to go much further.
I would add that watching the development, and our ADU was just completed last month. Our tenants moving in on Monday, I think. That the growth of the industry, that is professionals who can counsel you, can help with financing, builds on itself. And so although there's been a drop, as Cole Peterson has noted, in ADU production, partly as a result of the city's decision to not put a sunset on the waiver of system development charges. So everyone was racing to get their permit before the waiver expired, which is worth about $15,000. Now that it's permanent, there's been a drop. At the same time, I would say that the costs of construction have gone up so much that ADUs have become more expensive. But that as the industry grows, people learn more, people look across the street and see an ADU, you see more ADUs being built. But I would echo the comments about it's a small contribution. We need to be thinking more broadly about a lot of housing innovations and finance. I have a question from—
Can I jump in on that one briefly?
Yes, I have a few more questions coming in.
Cool. I just wanted to say, I think Robert knows about this more than I do, but I feel like financing is a massive obstacle, and the way that a lot of the ADUs in Portland has been financed is because of an increase in home values. And when the home values stopped shooting up after the recession sort of leveled off, that's what slowed ADU production, in my view. And it's going to be the exact same issue with fourplex legalization.
There is a panel discussion at the Build Small, Live Large Summit on November 7th here in Portland that I'm leading a panel discussion on innovations in ADU finance. There are both the private sector, public sector, and nonprofits are getting really interested in this, how to finance ADUs and other forms of innovative housing. So that might be a place where people can learn some more about those innovations. Colin Clark asked this question: in each place, can homeowner associations still ban ADUs, duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes despite state or local regulations? Council President Bender, is that an issue that you discussed at all?
It didn't come up. I'm thinking now that I doubt that we're able to under our current state law, but I love the state law change in Oregon about covenants. that would be more likely to happen here. We don't have like neighborhood level homeowner associations, and we don't have a lot of condos in Minneapolis. The market doesn't support them for various reasons.
In California, we actually have a bill, I think it's on the governor's desk now, although I'll have to double check that. We had the end of session rush, to prohibit HOAs from restricting ADUs. In California, a pretty significant percentage of our housing stock statewide are HOAs, whether condos, but also single family home areas. And it has been an issue. So I think that bill's on the governor's desk.
All right, I think we're about ready to wind up, and I'm sorry if we didn't get to all your questions. Let me remind people that next Wednesday, October 2nd, we have another webinar, this time devoted to 5 pilot projects in different parts of the country in which ADUs are being deployed as a way of addressing equity objectives and affordability, specifically on the equity side on wealth creation and anti-displacement. And those projects are really different parts of the country, from Washington, D.C. To Los Angeles. Later in October, we'll have another webinar, which is on all the educational assistance programs and materials being offered to homeowners who are considering this big decision about whether to build an accessory dwelling unit. And those educational and assistance services are provided by governments, by nonprofits, and now for-profits, people in the ADU development business. We don't have that scheduled, but we'll be sending out a notice. I'd like to thank all of our panelists today for your leadership, not just your contribution to our collective understanding about how to advance this major change, but also to your leadership in changing your communities. Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.